The hemp rope creaked against weathered barn rafters as Thomas Whitfield's boots swayed 3 feet above the Richmond tobacco floor. Dawn light filtered through gaps in the wooden slats, illuminating a scene that would shatter the carefully constructed order of 1847 Virginia plantation life. This wasn't suicide. The positioning was all wrong, the knots too precise, the timing too calculated. One enslaved man had just crossed a line that would cost him everything, but not before he'd proven that even the most powerless could wield absolute power when pushed beyond endurance. Anna stood in the barn doorway, his calloused hands still rope-burned from the night's work, watching the overseer's corpse twist slowly in the morning breeze. For 12 years, Whitfield had ruled the Henderson plantation with systematic cruelty that went far beyond the accepted brutalities of the institution. He'd separated families for sport, withheld rations as punishment, and used his position to satisfy darker appetites that even other overseers whispered about. But last night, Anna had discovered Whitfield's plan to sell his 10-year-old daughter Lucy to a brothel in Norfolk. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the tobacco fields. Master Henderson returning early from his Richmond business trip. Anna had perhaps 5 minutes before his world exploded into manhunts, bloodhounds, and the kind of justice that Virginia reserved for enslaved people who dared touch white flesh. But those 5 minutes felt like a lifetime as he stood there, savoring the sight of Thomas Whitfield's final humiliation. Before we dive deeper into this explosive moment that would ignite one of Virginia's most desperate manhunts, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records and family whispers for over a century and a half. The Henderson plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of prime Virginia tobacco country, where the James River curved like a serpent through rolling hills that had grown rich on human bondage. Master William Henderson had inherited the estate from his father, along with 137 enslaved people, treating the property, both land and human, as investments to be maximized rather than lives to be considered. He'd hired Thomas Whitfield as overseer specifically for his reputation as a man who could squeeze productivity from even the most troublesome workers. Anna had been born on the plantation 32 years earlier, his mother dying in childbirth. His father sold away before he could walk. He'd grown up under Henderson's father's regime, which had been harsh but predictable. The younger Henderson's arrival 5 years ago had brought changes, and those changes had intensified when Whitfield took over as overseer 18 months past. The new system operated on psychological terror as much as physical punishment. Whitfield understood that breaking spirits was more effective than breaking bodies. From plantation records dated March 15, 1846. Overseer T. Whitfield reports significant improvement in daily tobacco yields. Disciplinary measures proving effective. No runaways this quarter. But Anna possessed something that made him dangerous in ways Whitfield never recognized. He could read, a skill taught by Henderson's late wife during her brief attempts at Christian education before her husband forbade such activities. Those reading lessons had opened Anna's mind to possibilities beyond the plantation boundaries, to newspapers smuggled by sympathetic house servants, to whispered conversations about places where men like him lived free. Knowledge had made him patient, calculating, willing to wait for the perfect moment. That moment had arrived last Tuesday when he'd overheard Whitfield negotiating with a man from Norfolk, discussing prices for young merchandise, and specifically mentioning Lucy's potential for training. Anna had spent 12 years watching Whitfield's cruelties with strategic silence, biding his time, waiting for provocation severe enough to justify the consequences he knew would follow. Selling his daughter into sexual bondage was that provocation. The barn where Whitfield now hung had been Anna's workplace for most of his adult life. He knew every beam, every hiding place, every entrance and exit. More importantly, he knew Whitfield's habits, the overseer's nightly inspections of the tobacco stores, his pattern of checking the barn last before heading to his quarters. Anna had prepared for months, studying knots learned from watching ships dock at the plantation's river landing, practicing with scraps of rope during the precious minutes between supervised work and mandated sleep. What would you do if you discovered someone planning to sell your child into a fate worse than death? How far would you go to protect the one person who gave your existence meaning? The hoofbeats grew louder as Master Henderson's horse thundered up the plantation drive, unaware that his world was about to transform from profitable routine into deadly chaos. Master William Henderson's riding boots struck the parlor floorboards like gavels announcing judgment as he paced between mahogany furniture that had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. The telegram crumpled in his fist contained news that would transform his profitable morning into a nightmare of legal complications and financial ruin. Thomas Whitfield was dead, and the circumstances surrounding his death threatened to destroy everything Henderson had built. The discovery of a murdered overseer on a Virginia plantation in 1847 carried implications that reached far beyond simple crime. It challenged the fundamental assumptions of a society built on the premise that enslaved people were docile property incapable of organized resistance. Henderson had returned from Richmond at 7:30 that morning, expecting to find his plantation operating with its usual efficiency. Instead, he discovered chaos. Field hands standing idle in the tobacco rows, house servants whispering in clusters, and an atmosphere of barely contained tension that spoke of significant events. The barn discovery had followed within minutes. Whitfield's corpse hanging from rafters with professional precision, rope burns on his wrists, suggesting he'd been bound before being hauled aloft. The scene bore none of the hallmarks of spontaneous violence. Someone had planned this execution with meticulous care, studying Whitfield's routines, preparing materials, choosing a location that would maximize psychological impact while minimizing immediate discovery. The positioning of the body, the type of knots used, even the timing of the killing. Everything suggested calculation rather than passion. From the diary of Dr. James Crawford, Henderson plantation physician, August 13, 1847. Examined deceased overseer Thomas Whitfield. Rope burns on wrists indicate prolonged struggle. Cause of death, strangulation by hanging. Estimated time of death, between midnight and 3 a.m. No signs of defensive wounds. Victim was likely ambushed. Henderson's immediate concern wasn't justice, it was containment. News of an overseer's murder would spread through Virginia's plantation network like wildfire, potentially inspiring copycat incidents across the state. Enslaved people on neighboring properties would hear whispered accounts of Whitfield's death, and some might begin considering similar actions against their own oppressors. The economic and social implications were staggering. But Henderson faced an even more pressing problem. Virginia law required immediate notification of violent crimes involving enslaved people, triggering investigations that would bring unwanted scrutiny to his plantation's operations. Whitfield's methods had generated impressive tobacco yields, but they'd also pushed legal boundaries regarding acceptable treatment of human property. A thorough investigation might reveal practices that could damage Henderson's reputation among Richmond's planter elite. The missing piece of this puzzle became apparent when Henderson discovered Anna's empty cabin. The 10-year-old girl, Lucy, was also gone, along with a substantial quantity of food supplies and Henderson's own travel documents, stolen from his study with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the house layout. This wasn't random violence followed by panic. It was the opening move in a carefully orchestrated escape plan. Anna had vanished like smoke in wind, but his absence spoke volumes. In a community where every face was known, every movement monitored, his disappearance could only mean extensive preparation. Someone had been planning this moment for months, studying guard patterns, identifying escape routes, building networks of support that extended beyond plantation boundaries. The bloodhounds arrived at noon, professional slave catchers hired by Henderson to track runaways across Virginia's challenging terrain. These men possessed reputations for never losing prey, using techniques perfected through decades of hunting human beings through swamps, forests, and mountain passes. Their leader, Samuel Morrison, examined the barn scene with predatory interest, noting details that would help predict Anna's likely escape route. But Morrison discovered something that transformed this case from routine fugitive recovery into something far more complex. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in Anna's cabin lay evidence of extensive literacy: newspapers, hand-copied maps, even crude sketches of plantation layouts from neighboring properties. This wasn't simply an angry slave lashing out at his oppressor. This was an intelligent man who'd been gathering intelligence and planning rebellion on a scale that threatened Virginia's entire plantation system. Henderson stood in the empty cabin, surrounded by evidence of capabilities he'd never suspected. The newspapers dated back months, suggesting Anna had been building understanding of political developments across the state. The maps showed detailed knowledge of river systems, road networks, even safe houses used by the Underground Railroad. Most disturbing were the sketches, accurate drawings of other plantations' defensive arrangements, guard positions, and potential vulnerabilities. How many other enslaved people possessed similar knowledge but kept it hidden behind masks of compliance? How many were watching, waiting, learning from Anna's example? The sun climbed higher as search parties fanned out across Henderson's property, their shouts echoing through tobacco fields where work had stopped entirely. 136 enslaved people standing witness to the beginning of what would become Virginia's most intensive manhunt. The Underground Railroad station, hidden beneath Richmond's Christ Episcopal Church, operated with clockwork precision every third Wednesday, moving human cargo through Virginia's capital under the noses of the state's most powerful slaveholders. Anna crouched in the cramped cellar space, Lucy pressed against his side, listening to footsteps echo through the sanctuary above as morning parishioners gathered for prayer. Those same worshipers had no idea their church basement concealed the most sophisticated escape network in the Upper South. This wasn't simply about one man's desperate flight. Anna's rebellion had exposed a conspiracy that reached into Richmond's highest social circles, threatening to unravel decades of carefully constructed resistance operations. The station master was someone Anna had never expected: Margaret Whitlock, wife of Virginia's Attorney General, whose Sunday morning Bible readings had apparently inspired more than spiritual devotion. She descended the narrow stairs at 8:45 a.m. carrying a basket of communion bread that concealed forged travel documents bearing Anna's new identity as Samuel Freeman, free black carpenter traveling to Baltimore. The transformation required would be dramatic, but Margaret's network had been perfecting such operations for nearly a decade. Anna learned the scope of the conspiracy as Margaret explained their route north. The network included a tobacco merchant who provided legitimate cargo wagons for concealment, a railroad conductor who ensured certain freight cars remained unlocked during specific stops, and even a federal customs inspector whose moral awakening had led him to falsify shipping manifests. Each participant risked career destruction or imprisonment, yet the operation had moved over 200 enslaved people to freedom without a single capture. The irony was profound. Anna's violent rebellion had delivered him into the hands of the very people he'd never imagined existed. White Virginians risking everything to undermine the system that defined their society, operating under cover of respectability, while systematically dismantling slavery from within. Margaret's husband prosecuted fugitive slave cases by day, while she facilitated escapes by night, creating a moral contradiction that somehow functioned with deadly efficiency. From a coded letter found in Margaret Whitlock's effects after her death in 1863, package delivered safely Tuesday. Samuel Freeman merchandise reached Baltimore distribution point without incident. Recommend increased caution following plantation difficulties in Richmond vicinity. But Anna's presence had complicated everything. The Henderson plantation manhunt was unlike routine fugitive pursuits. The murder of an overseer had triggered state-level involvement, bringing federal marshals and professional bounty hunters into Virginia with unprecedented resources. Every station along the Underground Railroad faced heightened scrutiny, forcing operational changes that could compromise months of careful planning. Lucy had remained silent since witnessing Whitfield's execution, her young mind struggling to process the transformation of her gentle father into someone capable of calculated killing. Anna watched her trace patterns on the cellar's dirt floor, wondering what psychological scars this journey would leave. He'd saved her from one horror only to expose her to others, trading certain degradation for uncertain freedom with consequences that might haunt them both forever. The church bells rang 9 a.m. as Margaret explained their immediate challenge. Word of Whitfield's death had reached Richmond's newspapers, creating public hysteria about slave insurrections that made any movement of black people exponentially more dangerous. Roadblocks had been established on every major route north, with militia units authorized to detain and question anyone who couldn't provide ironclad documentation of their legal status. Margaret's solution was audacious: hide in plain sight. Rather than skulking through back roads like typical fugitives, Anna and Lucy would travel as part of a missionary group heading to Philadelphia, complete with Methodist credentials and a cover story about establishing schools for free blacks. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was certain capture as search parties systematically eliminated every conventional escape route. Anna studied the forged documents with mixture of amazement and terror. The quality was extraordinary. Official seals, proper watermarks, even aging techniques that made the papers appear months old. Someone with access to government printing facilities had produced these documents, suggesting the conspiracy reached deeper into Virginia's power structure than anyone suspected. How many other officials were quietly undermining the system they'd sworn to uphold? The psychological warfare had begun immediately. By 10 a.m., news of Whitfield's murder had spread to every plantation within 50 miles, creating panic among overseers who suddenly realized their own vulnerability. Some had already fled their positions, abandoning properties to avoid becoming targets. Others had armed themselves heavily, treating every enslaved person as a potential assassin. The economic disruption was immediate and severe. Tobacco harvesting had stopped on multiple plantations as owners struggled to maintain control over increasingly agitated workforces. Margaret revealed the most shocking intelligence as they prepared to leave. Anna wasn't the first to rebel. Similar incidents had occurred across Virginia over the past 2 years. each carefully concealed by authorities to prevent inspiring copycat actions. The Underground Railroad had been monitoring these events, noting patterns that suggested coordinated resistance rather than isolated violence. Someone was teaching enslaved people not just to escape, but to fight back with methods that maximized psychological impact while minimizing immediate capture risks. What kind of person could simultaneously inspire such deadly violence and such sophisticated mercy? The sanctuary doors opened above them as the morning service ended, sending hundreds of footsteps echoing through floorboards that concealed Virginia's most dangerous secret. Proof that the system's greatest enemies might be hiding among its most respected defenders. Samuel Morrison's bloodhounds caught Anna's scent at the river landing where tobacco barges loaded their cargo, their baying voices cutting through the humid Virginia morning like hymns of pursuit. The professional slave catcher knelt beside muddy footprints that told a story of careful planning. 2 sets of tracks, adult and child, moving with purpose rather than panic toward the water's edge. This wasn't the desperate flight of typical runaways, but the methodical execution of a plan months in the making. Morrison had tracked over 300 fugitive slaves during his 20-year career, but something about this case felt different. The killer he pursued possessed intelligence and resources that transformed routine manhunt into deadly chess match. The footprints led to a dock where the steamboat Richmond Belle had departed at 5:15 a.m., bound for Baltimore with stops in Fredericksburg and Washington. Morrison examined the passenger manifest with growing frustration. No entries for Anna or Lucy, but several suspicious notations including Samuel Freeman, carpenter, and Methodist missionary group traveling to Philadelphia. The timing aligned perfectly with the fugitives' estimated departure from Henderson Plantation. Morrison's reputation had been built on understanding how desperate people thought, anticipating their mistakes, exploiting their fears. But Anna had displayed none of the typical patterns. No panicked flight through familiar terrain, no attempts to reach known safe houses, no contact with family members on neighboring plantations. Instead, he'd vanished into Virginia's legitimate transportation network, using methods that suggested extensive preparation and sophisticated support. The psychological profile emerging from witness interviews painted a disturbing picture. Anna had been considered a model slave for 12 years. Compliant, hard-working, never causing trouble. House servants described him as quiet but respectful. Field hands remembered him as someone who helped others without complaint. Even Henderson had regarded him as trustworthy enough to work unsupervised in the tobacco barns. The transformation from model slave to calculating killer challenged everything Morrison thought he understood about enslaved people's capacity for deception. From Morrison's professional notes, August 13, 1847. Subject Anna demonstrates unprecedented planning capabilities. Recommend increasing reward to $1,000. This fugitive poses extreme danger to Virginia's plantation system if allowed to escape successfully. The investigation had revealed disturbing evidence of widespread literacy among Henderson's enslaved population. Hidden beneath cabin floorboards, investigators found newspapers, hand-copied letters, even crude maps showing routes to northern cities. The discovery suggested Anna hadn't acted alone. Someone had been teaching reading and writing in direct violation of Virginia law, creating an underground education network that could facilitate rebellion on massive scale. Henderson faced growing pressure from neighboring plantation owners who demanded immediate results. The murder of an overseer had created panic throughout Richmond's planter community, with some families fleeing to the city until the situation stabilized. Tobacco harvesting had ceased on multiple properties, as owners struggled to maintain control over workforces that suddenly seemed filled with potential assassins. The economic impact was already substantial, and growing worse each day the killer remained free. But Morrison's greatest challenge was the conspiracy's apparent sophistication. The Underground Railroad network operating in Virginia possessed resources and connections that rivaled any criminal organization he'd encountered. Forged documents of extraordinary quality, safe houses in respectable neighborhoods, transportation arrangements that utilized legitimate businesses. Someone with significant financial backing was funding these operations. The manhunt expanded beyond Virginia as federal marshals joined the pursuit. Anna's case had attracted national attention, with newspapers across the South demanding swift justice to prevent inspiring copycat incidents. The reward had increased to $1,500, enough to motivate every bounty hunter from Maryland to Georgia. Professional slave catchers descended on Virginia like locusts, each hoping to claim the substantial payment for Anna's capture. Lucy's presence complicated every aspect of the pursuit. Moving with a child would slow Anna's progress, limit his options, make him more memorable to witnesses. But it also provided motivation that transformed desperation into deadly determination. Morrison had seen what fathers would do to protect their children. The quiet banker who'd killed 3 men pursuing his daughter. The shopkeeper who'd held off militia units for 6 hours defending his family. Anna possessed that same protective instinct, amplified by years of systematic oppression. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Anna had intended. Fear was spreading through Virginia's plantation system like contagion, undermining the fundamental assumption that enslaved people would remain docile as long as punishment was swift and severe. Overseers across the state were resigning their positions, fleeing to cities where angry slaves couldn't reach them in isolated barns. The labor shortage was becoming critical as harvest season approached. Morrison studied the evidence one more time as evening approached. The killer he pursued wasn't simply running, he was teaching. Every aspect of this escape demonstrated techniques that could be replicated by others, showing enslaved people across the South that even the most powerless could strike back effectively when properly prepared. How many others were watching Anna's escape, learning from his methods, planning their own rebellions? The steamboat Richmond Belle disappeared around a bend in the James River, carrying its human cargo toward uncertain freedom, while behind them, Virginia's most intensive manhunt prepared to follow every lead across 3 states. The Methodist congregation at Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia sang hymns that masked the sound of hushed conversations between pews, their voices rising in spiritual harmony while underground networks exchanged information about the most wanted fugitive in America. Anna sat in the back row wearing clothes that transformed him from plantation field hand into respectable free black carpenter, Lucy beside him, clutching a hymnal she couldn't yet read. The Sunday morning service provided perfect cover for what would become the most audacious identity swap in Underground Railroad history. The congregation included some of Philadelphia's most prominent abolitionists, but it also contained federal informants whose job was identifying fugitive slaves seeking sanctuary in the city's free black community. Reverend Daniel Payne had been expecting them since Thursday, when coded messages from Richmond indicated high-value cargo would arrive, needing immediate processing. But Anna's case presented unprecedented challenges. His photograph had appeared in newspapers across 3 states, making conventional hiding impossible. The solution required complete transformation, not just of appearance, but of documented history stretching back years. The operation began during communion service as Anna and Lucy moved through carefully choreographed positions. In the basement, a team of forgers worked with materials that rivaled government printing quality. Birth certificates, work contracts, even church membership records dating back to 1843. Someone with access to official documentation had provided templates that would survive scrutiny from federal marshals trained to detect fraudulent papers. Anna learned his new biography as Lucy received her first formal education lesson. He was now Samuel Freeman, born free in Pennsylvania, widowed carpenter whose wife had died of consumption 2 years prior. Lucy became Sarah Freeman, his daughter who'd been living with relatives in Baltimore while he established his carpentry business. The cover story included manufactured memories, rehearsed conversations, even calluses created on his hands to match his supposed profession. From a letter discovered in Reverend Payne's papers, dated August 16, 1847, the Freeman family has integrated successfully into our congregation. Samuel's carpentry skills prove valuable for church renovation projects. Sarah shows remarkable intelligence for her age. But Philadelphia's Underground Railroad faced its own crisis. Federal marshals had flooded the city following Anna's escape, conducting random searches of black neighborhoods and questioning anyone whose documentation appeared suspicious. The Fugitive Slave Act had transformed every free black person into potential contraband, requiring constant proof of legal status that could be challenged without warning. Anna's presence had intensified scrutiny that threatened operations across the entire network. The psychological transformation proved as challenging as the physical one. Anna had to unlearn 12 years of trained subservience, replacing automatic deference with the confident bearing of a free man. He practiced walking with his head up, making eye contact with white people, speaking without permission, behaviors that could have gotten him killed on Henderson Plantation, but were essential for survival in Philadelphia's complex racial landscape. Lucy's adjustment was equally dramatic. She'd spent 10 years learning to become invisible, avoiding attention that might bring punishment. Now she needed to become curious, talkative, eager to learn, qualities that marked her as belonging to Philadelphia's educated free black community. The contradiction between her natural intelligence and her trained silence created behavioral patterns that required careful coaching to overcome. The fugitive network's sophistication became apparent as Anna learned about parallel operations across the North. Safe houses in New York were processing similar refugees, while Canadian stations prepared for the influx of freedom seekers fleeing Virginia's intensified patrols. Each location operated independently, but shared information through coded correspondence that utilized legitimate business channels to avoid detection. Morrison's investigation had reached Philadelphia by Tuesday, bringing bloodhounds and federal resources that forced the network to implement emergency protocols. Known safe houses were evacuated, key operatives disappeared into the city's general population, and communication systems shifted to backup methods that relied on seemingly innocent interactions between strangers. The manhunt's intensity was disrupting operations that had functioned smoothly for decades. Anna discovered the true scope of resistance during a late-night meeting in the church basement. Representatives from stations across the Northeast reported similar cases, enslaved people who'd fought back against their oppressors before escaping, using violence as psychological warfare against the institution of slavery itself. Someone was teaching rebellion techniques that maximized impact while minimizing immediate capture risks, spreading tactics through networks that authorities couldn't penetrate. The most disturbing intelligence came from Virginia contacts who reported copycat incidents. 3 overseers had been found dead under suspicious circumstances since Whitfield's murder, each killed using methods that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The rebellion Anna had started was spreading faster than authorities could contain, inspiring others to take actions they'd never considered before witnessing his successful escape. Margaret Whitlock's network had been compromised following intensive investigation of her husband's activities. The Attorney General's wife had disappeared, along with several other Richmond conspirators, abandoning operations that had taken years to establish. Anna's violent rebellion had achieved freedom for himself and Lucy, but at the cost of destroying infrastructure that had saved hundreds of others. What price was acceptable for individual freedom when collective liberation might be possible through patience and systematic resistance? The church bells chimed midnight as Anna stood at his boarding house window, watching federal patrols search Philadelphia's streets for a ghost who'd already transformed into someone new, but whose violent legacy continued spreading through Virginia's plantation system like wildfire that no amount of manhunting could extinguish. The Virginia State Capitol building echoed with urgent footsteps as Governor William Smith convened an emergency session to address what newspapers were calling the greatest threat to Southern civilization since Nat Turner's rebellion. Anna's successful escape had inspired copycat killings across 3 states, transforming isolated violence into coordinated uprising that threatened the economic foundation of the entire plantation system. The mahogany-paneled chamber where legislators debated normally concerned itself with tariffs and territorial expansion, but today's agenda focused on preventing total social collapse. The rebellion had evolved beyond individual acts of revenge into systematic warfare that could destroy Virginia's $40 million investment in human property within months if left unchecked. Governor Smith read reports that painted a terrifying picture of coordinated resistance. 7 overseers had been murdered in Virginia alone since Whitfield's death, each killing demonstrating techniques that suggested shared training rather than spontaneous violence. Similar incidents had occurred in North Carolina, Maryland, and Tennessee, creating a pattern that implied organization stretching across state lines. The Underground Railroad had apparently evolved from passive rescue operations into active rebellion coordination. The economic impact was already devastating. Tobacco harvesting had ceased on over 30 plantations as overseers fled their positions, abandoning properties worth millions of dollars. Insurance companies were refusing to cover plantation operations, arguing that systematic rebellion constituted acts of war beyond normal policy coverage. Banks had begun calling in loans secured by enslaved people, recognizing that human collateral might rebel or escape without warning. From Virginia Governor William Smith's private correspondence, August 20th, 1847. The Anna incident has unleashed forces that threaten our entire social order. Immediate action required to prevent complete economic collapse. Federal intervention may be necessary. But the most disturbing intelligence came from Morrison's investigation into the Underground Railroad's transformation. Federal agents had discovered evidence of military-style training camps hidden in Pennsylvania's mountains, where escaped slaves learned combat techniques before returning south as instructors. Someone with professional military experience was teaching enslaved people not just to fight, but to fight effectively using methods designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing capture risks. The network's sophistication had evolved far beyond anything authorities had imagined. Coded communications utilized legitimate business channels, with messages hidden in shipping invoices, church newsletters, even sheet music distributed through normal commercial networks. Safe houses operated under cover of respectable businesses, while forged documents rivaled government printing quality. The conspiracy included merchants, ministers, federal employees, even military officers whose moral awakening had led them to undermine the system they'd sworn to protect. Anna had become more than fugitive. He'd become symbol. Enslaved people across the South whispered his name like prayer, sharing stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed he could walk through walls, others that he commanded supernatural powers that made him invisible to bloodhounds. The mythology was more dangerous than the man himself, inspiring others to attempt similar rebellions with varying degrees of success. The psychological warfare was working exactly as intended. Plantation owners lived in constant fear, sleeping with loaded weapons beside their beds, treating every enslaved person as potential assassin. The social fabric that held Southern society together was unraveling as trust disappeared between masters and servants, overseers and field hands, even family members who might harbor secret sympathies for the rebellion. Morrison's manhunt had expanded into the largest fugitive pursuit in American history, involving federal marshals, state militias, and private bounty hunters across 6 states. The reward had increased to $3,000, enough to motivate professional slave catchers to abandon other pursuits in favor of hunting Anna. But the trail had gone cold in Philadelphia, where the Underground Railroad's security measures had proven impenetrable even to federal investigation. The conspiracy's reach became apparent during interrogations of captured network members. Under pressure, some revealed connections that extended into Congress itself, with several representatives secretly funding Underground Railroad operations while publicly supporting slavery. The revelation threatened to trigger political crisis that could split the Union along moral lines rather than sectional interests. Lucy's presence in the escape had created additional symbolic power that authorities struggled to counter. The image of father protecting daughter from sexual exploitation resonated even among white Southerners who supported slavery, creating moral contradictions that undermined systematic oppression. Stories spread of Anna's desperate love for his child, transforming him from dangerous criminal into tragic hero whose violence seemed justified by circumstances. The governor's emergency session produced desperate measures. Martial law was declared in 7 Virginia counties, with military patrols authorized to shoot suspected fugitives on sight. Rewards were offered for information leading to Underground Railroad arrests, encouraging betrayal within communities that had previously maintained united silence. Travel restrictions limited movement of all Black people, free or enslaved, requiring documentation that many couldn't provide. But the most telling response was what wasn't discussed in official proceedings. Private conversations between plantation owners revealed growing recognition that the system itself might be unsustainable. The level of violence required to maintain control was becoming economically prohibitive, while the psychological costs were breaking down social relationships that had functioned for generations. How could a civilization built on human bondage survive when the bondage itself inspired such systematic rebellion? The Capitol building's clock tower chimed 9 p.m. as legislators departed for homes they no longer felt safe in, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, Anna's example continued inspiring others to transform desperation into deadly purpose. The frozen Hudson River stretched like a mirror beneath Anna's feet as he and Lucy crossed into Canada on the morning of February 14, 1848, their breath-forming clouds that dissipated into freedom's bitter air. 6 months of careful movement through Underground Railroad stations had brought them to this moment, the final step across an invisible line that transformed them from hunted fugitives into protected refugees. Behind them lay the most intensive manhunt in American history. Ahead stretched possibilities that neither had dared imagine during their years of bondage. Anna's successful escape had accomplished something unprecedented, proving that even the most powerless could strike back effectively against systematic oppression while achieving actual freedom rather than simply martyrdom. The St. Catharines settlement, where they found sanctuary, operated openly as refugee community, housing over 400 former slaves who'd made similar journeys. Anna discovered a world where black people owned businesses, attended schools, participated in government, realities that challenged everything he'd been taught about his race's supposed capabilities. Lucy enrolled in classes taught by teachers who looked like her, learning mathematics and literature that plantation owners had insisted were beyond African comprehension. But Anna's reputation had followed him across international borders. Canadian authorities monitored his activities carefully, aware that Virginia's governor had unofficially offered $5,000 for his return, regardless of legal technicalities. Federal agents operated in Canada despite having no jurisdiction, gathering intelligence about underground railroad networks while maintaining diplomatic relations that prohibited direct action against refugees. The psychological transformation from slave to free man proved more challenging than physical escape. Anna struggled with decision-making freedom after years of having every choice made for him, experienced panic attacks when white people approached without warning, found himself unconsciously deferring to authority figures who had no power over him. Lucy adapted more quickly, her young mind embracing educational opportunities with enthusiasm that reminded Anna of his own secret learning under Henderson's regime. From the records of the St. Catharines Anti-Slavery Society, March 3, 1848. Samuel Freeman has integrated well into our community. His carpentry skills prove valuable, though he remains vigilant about security concerns. Daughter Sarah demonstrates exceptional academic ability. The ripple effects of Anna's rebellion continued spreading through the American South, despite his physical absence. Morrison's investigation had identified over 30 copycat incidents directly inspired by Whitfield's murder, creating a pattern of violence that transformed individual grievances into systematic warfare. Plantation owners faced impossible choices: increased security at unsustainable cost, or risk rebellion from workforces that had lost their fear of white authority. Underground railroad operations had evolved in response to increased federal scrutiny. New routes bypassed traditional stations, utilizing ship networks that moved refugees directly from southern ports to Canadian destinations. Communication systems employed increasingly sophisticated codes that utilized everything from quilt patterns to church hymns, making interception nearly impossible, even when authorities knew messages were being transmitted. Anna learned about parallel developments during community meetings where refugees shared intelligence from contacts still in bondage. The rebellion techniques he'd pioneered were being refined and systematized, with instruction networks teaching enslaved people not just how to escape, but how to fight back effectively before fleeing. Someone with military experience was coordinating these operations, transforming spontaneous violence into strategic warfare. The economic impact on Virginia's plantation system had exceeded worst-case projections. Labor shortages during harvest season had cost tobacco growers over $2 million in lost revenue, while insurance costs for plantation operations had increased by 300%. Some owners were selling properties at substantial losses rather than risk continued exposure to systematic rebellion. But the most significant change was psychological. The mythology surrounding Anna's escape had evolved beyond factual events into inspirational legend that gave enslaved people hope for possibilities beyond endurance. Stories circulated of other successful rebellions, of masters fleeing their own plantations in fear, of entire communities achieving freedom through coordinated resistance. Lucy's education provided Anna with a glimpse of what their lives might have become under different circumstances. Her quick mastery of reading and mathematics demonstrated intelligence that plantation system had systematically suppressed. while her artistic abilities suggested talents that bondage had never allowed to develop. Every lesson she learned represented victory over forces that had sought to limit her potential permanently. The winter of 1848 brought disturbing news from Morrison's continued investigation. Federal authorities had infiltrated several underground railroad stations, arresting key operatives whose prosecutions might reveal the full scope of resistance networks. The cases would likely reach Supreme Court level, potentially establishing precedents that could criminalize abolitionist activities throughout the North. Anna faced a crucial decision as spring approached: remain safely anonymous in Canada or risk everything by returning to help coordinate resistance operations that his example had inspired. The choice represented a fundamental question about individual versus collective liberation. Was personal freedom sufficient when millions remained in bondage? Or did survival create obligation to help others achieve similar escape? What would you do if your successful rebellion had inspired others to risk everything following your example? The morning sun reflected off ice that would soon melt into rushing water, carrying news of freedom's possibilities back toward the land where Anna's violence had planted seeds that continued growing in darkness beyond any overseer's control. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Detective William Hayes's boots as he examined the barn rafters where another overseer had been found hanging, this one outside Atlanta in 1851, 4 years after Anna's original rebellion had shattered Virginia's plantation system. The rope work was identical to Thomas Whitfield's murder. Professional knots, calculated positioning, even the same type of hemp cord that suggested deliberate mimicry rather than coincidence. Someone was still teaching Anna's methods, spreading his techniques across the South like a contagion that authorities couldn't contain. This wasn't copycat violence anymore. It had evolved into systematic warfare that used Anna's example as operational manual for coordinated resistance that threatened to destroy slavery from within. Hayes had tracked 17 similar murders across 6 states since 1847, each bearing hallmarks that connected them to Anna's original crime. The pattern suggested training networks that moved through enslaved communities like underground rivers, teaching rebellion techniques to carefully selected individuals who could execute them effectively before disappearing into the general population. Federal investigation had never located the source, but the consistency of methods indicated professional military instruction. The economic devastation had exceeded every projection. Over 200 plantations had been abandoned as overseers fled their positions, creating labor shortages that rippled through southern agriculture. Insurance companies had stopped covering plantation operations entirely, while banks demanded impossible security measures before approving loans secured by human property. The $40 million investment that Virginia alone held in enslaved people was becoming worthless as systematic rebellion made the institution economically unsustainable. But Anna himself had vanished completely. Morrison's investigation had traced him to Canada and then lost the trail entirely, as if he'd dissolved into the northern wilderness. Some claimed he'd died during the harsh winter of 1848. Others insisted he'd returned south to coordinate the resistance network that bore his influence. The uncertainty made him more dangerous than confirmed presence. He'd become mythology that inspired others to risk everything following his example. From the private journal of planter Edmund Ruffin, October 10, 1851. The Anna contagion continues spreading despite our best efforts at containment. Fear has replaced authority as the governing principle on plantations across the South. The institution cannot survive if our workers become our enemies. Lucy had thrived in Canadian freedom, becoming one of the first Black women admitted to Toronto's medical college in 1853. Her success represented everything Anna's rebellion had sought to achieve: transformation of enslaved child into educated professional whose potential could flourish without systematic oppression. She wrote letters to Underground Railroad contacts, describing life possibilities that seemed impossible to people still in bondage, but proved achievable through education and opportunity. The psychological impact had transformed Southern society in ways that political abolition never could have accomplished. White children grew up fearing the black faces that surrounded them, understanding instinctively that the system their parents defended created enemies rather than loyal servants. The social fabric that had held plantation culture together was unraveling as trust disappeared between racial groups that had coexisted through forced accommodation. Underground railroad operations had become increasingly sophisticated, utilizing Anna's example to recruit operatives who combined escape facilitation with active sabotage. Train schedules were disrupted to prevent slave catcher pursuits. Shipping records were falsified to hide refugee movements. Even telegraph communications were intercepted to provide advance warning of federal investigations. The network had evolved from rescue organization into resistance movement that waged systematic warfare against slavery itself. The manhunt for Anna had cost federal and state governments over $100,000 without achieving any significant arrests. Professional slave catchers had abandoned the pursuit after repeated failures, recognizing that the Underground Railroad's security measures had become impenetrable. Morrison himself had retired from fugitive hunting, claiming that Anna's case had revealed organized opposition too sophisticated for traditional tracking methods to overcome. But the most disturbing development was the spread of literacy among enslaved populations. Authorities discovered hidden schools operating on plantations across the South, teaching reading and writing using methods that Anna had pioneered under Henderson's regime. Each literate slave became potential organizer who could coordinate resistance activities, forge documents, or maintain communication networks that linked isolated communities into coordinated opposition. The rebellion had achieved something unprecedented in American history: systematic resistance that made slavery economically unsustainable while providing practical alternatives through successful escapes. Anna's violent example had demonstrated that even the most powerless could strike back effectively, inspiring others to transform desperation into deadly purpose that authorities couldn't predict or prevent. Hayes closed his investigation file as evening approached, knowing that tomorrow would bring reports of similar incidents from other states. The pattern would continue spreading as long as slavery existed, because Anna had proven that systematic oppression created systematic resistance. He'd shown enslaved people that freedom was achievable through careful planning, violent action, and coordinated support. Lessons that couldn't be unlearned, no matter how many manhunts failed to capture their original teacher. The barn fell silent except for wind through broken boards, carrying whispers of rebellion that would echo through American history until the institution itself collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Some say Anna's ghost still walks those rafters on moonless nights, teaching new generations the difference between survival and freedom. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.